The people who laugh at you today may one day bow before you. Charlotte Hayes had heard those words from her mother years ago, but standing beneath the glittering chandeliers of Mooncrest Palace, surrounded by hundreds of well-dressed wolves, they felt impossible to believe. The moon ceremony was the most important event of the year. Music drifted through the enormous ballroom, while noble families filled the marble floor, their laughter echoing beneath golden ceilings painted with the history of the kingdom. Every eligible Alpha and Omega had gathered to celebrate new bonds, new alliances, and new futures. For most people, it was a night of excitement. For Charlotte, it was becoming a nightmare. She stood alone near one of the towering windows overlooking the palace gardens, her simple pale blue gown noticeably less expensive than the elegant outfits worn by the noble daughters around her. Her blonde hair fell softly across her shoulders, and her blue eyes remained lowered as whispers followed her wherever she moved. Charlotte was used to being overlooked. She worked quietly in the royal archives, organizing records, restoring damaged books, and helping elderly scholars locate forgotten documents. Few people noticed her. Fewer cared. But tonight they noticed her for all the wrong reasons. There she is, a young noblewoman whispered loudly enough for others to hear. The Omega nobody wanted. Laughter followed. Charlotte pretended not to hear. She had learned long ago that responding only made things worse. Across the ballroom, Alpha King Ethan Blackwood stood among advisors and nobles. Tall, confident, and respected throughout the kingdom, he carried himself with effortless authority. His dark suit contrasted sharply against the brilliant lights of the palace. Whenever he spoke, conversations paused. Whenever he moved, people watched. Charlotte's eyes drifted toward him for only a moment before she looked away. There was no reason for a king to notice someone like her. Suddenly, the grand doors opened. A herald stepped forward. His Majesty will now announce the future Luna of Mooncrest. The ballroom instantly fell silent. Excitement rippled through the crowd. Charlotte felt her stomach tighten. She knew who everyone expected Ethan to choose. Olivia Sterling stood proudly near the center of the room, dressed in a silver gown that sparkled beneath the lights. Beautiful, wealthy, and born into one of the kingdom's most influential families, she looked every bit the future queen. Ethan stepped onto the raised platform. "Tonight," he announced, "I wish to recognize someone whose loyalty and dedication have greatly benefited this kingdom." Olivia's smile widened. Several nobles began nodding confidently. Then Ethan extended his hand toward Olivia. Applause erupted throughout the ballroom. Charlotte joined the applause despite the strange ache in her chest. She did not know why disappointment touched her. Perhaps because watching someone else's dream come true always reminded her that she had none of her own. Olivia accepted the attention with satisfaction. As she turned toward the crowd, her eyes found Charlotte. A slow smile crossed her face. "Some people are simply born for greatness," Olivia said loudly, "and others are destined to remain exactly where they belong." Several guests laughed. Charlotte felt heat rise to her cheeks. Around her, nobody defended her. Nobody objected. Even worse, nobody seemed surprised. She lowered her gaze and slipped a hand into her pocket, touching the old silver pendant her mother had left her before she died. It was the only family heirloom she possessed. The metal felt cool against her fingertips. Somehow it always brought comfort. Tonight, for the first time, even that comfort felt distant. Because while the kingdom celebrated under golden lights, Charlotte had no idea that the tiny pendant hidden in her hand carried a secret powerful enough to change everything. The celebration continued long after Charlotte slipped away from the ballroom. Music echoed through the palace halls while nobles laughed beneath crystal chandeliers, but she could not bear another minute of pretending their words did not hurt. She moved through a quiet corridor lined with portraits of former rulers, her footsteps soft against the polished marble floor. The silver pendant remained clenched in her hand. Whenever life became difficult, she found herself holding it without realizing it. Tonight was no different. She stopped beside a tall window overlooking the moonlit gardens below. Beyond the hedges and fountains, the lights of Mooncrest City shimmered in the distance. Thousands of people called this kingdom home. Yet Charlotte had never felt more alone. "You should be celebrating." The unexpected voice startled her. She turned and froze. Alpha King Ethan Blackwood stood a few feet away. Without the crowd surrounding him, he seemed different somehow. Less distant. Less untouchable. Charlotte immediately lowered her gaze. Your Majesty. Ethan glanced toward the gardens. You left the ceremony early. Charlotte forced a small smile. I did not want to interrupt the celebration. The answer sounded polite enough, but they both knew what she meant. Silence settled between them. For a brief moment, Ethan appeared as though he wanted to say something more. Then footsteps approached from the far end of the corridor. Olivia Sterling appeared, her silver gown catching the light with every step. There you are, she said warmly to Ethan before noticing Charlotte. The warmth vanished. I thought the staff had already cleared this area. Charlotte felt her face burn. Ethan's expression hardened slightly. Charlotte works in the Royal Archives. Olivia gave a dismissive shrug. Of course. I simply assumed she would know when a celebration no longer concerned her. The words landed precisely where intended. Charlotte nodded once. If you will excuse me. She walked away before either of them could respond. Neither saw the tears gathering in her eyes as she disappeared around the corner. The next morning, she returned to the Royal Archives before sunrise. The ancient building sat behind the palace grounds, filled with centuries of records, maps, and forgotten histories. It was the one place where she felt useful. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight. Here, books never judged anyone. Charlotte buried herself in work, hoping the ache in her chest would eventually fade. Hours later, while restoring a damaged ledger, she noticed an elderly scholar standing nearby. Professor Harold Whitmore was one of the kingdom's most respected historians. His silver hair and worn spectacles made him look as old as some of the books he studied. Miss Hayes, he said kindly, may I ask you something? Charlotte looked up. Of course. The professor's eyes settled on the silver pendant hanging around her neck. A strange expression crossed his face. Curiosity, confusion, almost disbelief. Where did you get that necklace? He asked quietly. Charlotte touched the pendant instinctively. It belonged to my mother. The elderly scholar stared at the symbol engraved on the worn silver surface. His hands trembled slightly. For the first time in decades, Professor Whitmore looked genuinely shocked. And somewhere deep within the archives, a secret buried for an entire generation had just begun to wake. Professor Whitmore did not speak for several seconds. He simply stared at the pendant as though he were looking at a ghost. Charlotte shifted uncomfortably beneath his gaze. Professor, she asked softly. The elderly historian blinked and seemed to return to the present. Forgive me, he said. May I examine it more closely? Charlotte hesitated before removing the silver pendant from around her neck. The chain was old and slightly worn. Her mother had given it to her shortly before her death, and Charlotte rarely let it leave her possession. Carefully, she placed it into the professor's trembling hands. Sunlight from the archive windows reflected across the faded silver surface. Professor Whitmore adjusted his spectacles and studied the engraving at its center. His eyes widened again. Remarkable, he whispered. Charlotte frowned. What is it? The professor looked up slowly. This symbol should not exist. A chill moved through her. I do not understand. He lowered his voice. Neither do I. Not yet. Without another explanation, he hurried toward a restricted section of the archives rarely visited by anyone. Charlotte followed him through narrow aisles lined with ancient records, dust-covered shelves that had not been touched in years. Finally, he stopped before a locked cabinet. After searching through several keys, he opened the door and carefully removed a large leather-bound volume. The cover appeared centuries old. He carried it to a nearby table and turned page after page with increasing urgency. Charlotte watched silently. Then he stopped. His finger landed on an illustration near the center of the book. Look! Charlotte leaned closer. The page displayed an image of an ornate royal crest surrounded by decorative markings. Her breath caught instantly. The symbol was identical to the engraving on her pendant. That cannot be possible, she whispered. Professor Whitmore nodded slowly. This emblem belonged to the House of Valemont. Charlotte stared at the page. I have never heard of them. Most people have not. His expression darkened. Because the family disappeared nearly 25 years ago. Charlotte's pulse quickened. What does that have to do with me? The professor closed the book carefully. I do not know yet. But the uncertainty in his voice sounded increasingly fragile. For the rest of the afternoon, they searched through records, family histories, and forgotten documents. The deeper they looked, the stranger everything became. Several references described members of the lost royal bloodline, carrying silver pendants bearing the exact symbol Charlotte possessed. Others mentioned a missing child who vanished during the final days of the dynasty. By sunset, Charlotte's head felt overwhelmed. None of it made sense. She was an orphan raised by an ordinary woman in a small village. She worked in an archive. She lived in a modest apartment above a bookstore. There was nothing remarkable about her life. Yet as she looked at the growing pile of evidence spread across the table, doubt began to creep into her thoughts. Professor Whitmore finally leaned back in his chair. His face looked pale. "Charlotte," he said quietly, "I think we need to be very careful about what we do next." "Why?" she asked. The historian glanced toward the archive windows where darkness had begun swallowing the evening sky. "Because if these records are accurate, the answers we are searching for could change far more than your life." The following week passed. Beneath a cloud of uncertainty, Professor Whitmore became increasingly cautious, insisting that every document be verified multiple times before drawing conclusions. Charlotte continued working in the archives during the day, but her thoughts rarely stayed focused on the books in front of her. Every time she touched the silver pendant resting against her chest, questions flooded her mind. Who had her mother really been? Why had she never spoken about the symbol? And why did ancient royal records seem connected to a life that looked nothing like her own? One rainy afternoon, Professor Whitmore arrived carrying a weathered storage box sealed with fading wax. His eyes shone with the excitement of someone who had finally found a missing piece of a puzzle. "I located it," he said breathlessly. Charlotte immediately stood. "Located what?" The professor carefully placed the box on a nearby table. "Records from the final year of House Valemont." Charlotte's heartbeat quickened. Together they opened the box. Inside were dozens of fragile documents, correspondence logs, family registries, and handwritten reports preserved for decades. Most had never been cataloged into the main archive system. As they examined the contents, one document after another revealed fragments of a story long forgotten. The final heirs of House Valemont had vanished during a political crisis. Rumors claimed the bloodline ended completely. Yet several reports contradicted that conclusion. One particular letter drew Professor Whitmore's attention immediately. He adjusted his spectacles and began reading aloud. "The infant has been safely removed from the capital. Her identity must remain hidden until the danger passes." Charlotte felt a chill travel through her body. "An infant?" she asked quietly. The professor nodded. "Continue reading." His voice sounded unusually serious. Charlotte took the document and scanned the remaining lines. The letter described a trusted guardian tasked with protecting a young girl connected to the royal family. The child's identifying details had been intentionally omitted. However, one detail remained. "The silver crest shall remain with her until the truth can be revealed." Charlotte's fingers tightened around the page. Her pendant suddenly felt heavier than ever before. Before either of them could speak, footsteps echoed through the archive corridor. Moments later, Alpha King Ethan Blackwood appeared. Charlotte's breath caught. Ethan rarely visited the archives personally. The sight of him standing among the towering shelves immediately drew attention from nearby staff members. "Professor," Ethan said, "I was told you requested access to restricted historical records." Professor Whitmore exchanged a brief glance with Charlotte. "Yes, Your Majesty." Ethan's gaze shifted toward the open documents scattered across the table. Curiosity flickered in his silver-gray eyes. "Have you discovered something important?" For a moment, nobody answered. Charlotte could feel her pulse pounding. The professor carefully closed the letter and rested both hands on the table. "Possibly," he said, "but the investigation is not complete." Ethan studied them both. Something in their expressions clearly caught his attention. As rain continued tapping against the tall windows, an uneasy silence settled across the room. Because for the first time, the secret hidden within Charlotte's past was no longer confined to forgotten records. It had begun attracting the attention of the king himself. Over the next several days, the investigation consumed nearly every spare moment inside the royal archives. Professor Whitmore worked tirelessly, cross-referencing ancient family records, forgotten census reports, and sealed correspondence that had remained untouched for decades. Charlotte assisted whenever she could, though the growing weight of uncertainty made concentration difficult. Each new discovery seemed impossible, yet somehow connected to the silver pendant she had carried her entire life. Meanwhile, Rumors began spreading quietly through the palace. Staff members noticed the unusual activity in the archives. Advisors observed the king making repeated visits to historical records. Questions multiplied. Answers remained elusive. One afternoon, Charlotte sat beside a large oak table covered in parchment when Professor Whitmore rushed into the room, carrying another stack of documents. His face was pale with disbelief. "I found the final registry," he said. Charlotte immediately stood. "The final registry of what?" The professor carefully placed the records on the table. "The surviving members of House Valemont." A nervous silence filled the room. Together they examined the fragile pages. Most names were crossed out, accompanied by notes marking deaths, disappearances, or unknown fates. Then they reached the final entry. Professor Whitmore's finger stopped beside a handwritten annotation added years after the original document was created. Charlotte leaned closer. Her heart pounded as she read the faded words. "Female child successfully relocated under protective identity. Location sealed by royal decree." Beneath the note sat a symbol identical to the one engraved on her pendant. Charlotte felt dizzy. "This cannot be happening," she whispered. The professor slowly nodded. "I was hoping I was mistaken." Before either of them could continue, footsteps echoed through the archive corridor. Several royal advisors entered, followed by Alpha King Ethan Blackwood. The atmosphere changed instantly. Ethan's expression was serious. "Professor Whitmore," he said, "you requested an official review." The elderly historian looked at Charlotte before taking a deep breath. "Yes, Your Majesty." Carefully, he presented the evidence gathered over the previous week. One document led to another. Family records connected to royal seals. Historical accounts referencing a missing heir. The silver pendant. The sealed registry. Every piece formed part of the same puzzle. The advisors exchanged stunned looks as the evidence accumulated. Ethan remained silent throughout the presentation. His silver-gray eyes never left the documents. Finally, the room fell quiet. Professor Whitmore placed both hands on the table. "There is no reasonable explanation remaining," he said softly. "All surviving evidence points toward the same conclusion." Charlotte could barely breathe. One advisor shook his head in disbelief. Another removed his glasses and stared at the records. Ethan slowly looked toward Charlotte. The expression on his face was unlike anything she had seen before. Not pity, not indifference. Shock. Genuine shock. "You believe Charlotte Hayes is connected to the royal bloodline," he said. The professor met his gaze. "No, Your Majesty." The old historian's voice trembled slightly. "I believe Charlotte Hayes is the last living heir of House Valemont." For a moment, nobody moved. Even the air seemed to stop. Charlotte stared at the pendant resting against her chest. The same pendant she had carried since childhood. The same pendant everyone ignored. And suddenly the life she thought she understood no longer existed. The revelation spread through Mooncrest Palace faster than anyone could contain it. By the following morning, whispers filled every corridor, every council chamber, and every noble gathering. Servants exchanged nervous glances. Advisors spoke in hushed voices. Noble families who had spent years ignoring Charlotte Hayes suddenly wanted answers. Charlotte wished she could disappear. Instead, she found herself sitting inside a private conference room overlooking the Eastern Gardens while Professor Whitmore and several royal historians continued reviewing evidence. Documents covered nearly every available surface. Family registries, sealed decrees, historical correspondence. Each record seemed to point toward the same impossible conclusion. Charlotte stared out the window as rain drifted softly across the palace grounds. Her reflection looked unfamiliar. The same face, the same blue eyes, the same blonde hair. Yet somehow everything felt different. "You have been quiet," Professor Whitmore said gently. Charlotte managed a faint smile. "I spent 23 years believing I knew who I was." The elderly historian nodded. "That is understandable. And now everyone expects me to become someone else." Before he could respond, the door opened. Alpha King Ethan Blackwood stepped inside. The room immediately fell silent. Several historians gathered their papers and quietly excused themselves, leaving only Ethan, Charlotte, and Professor Whitmore behind. Ethan approached slowly. His usual confidence seemed replaced by careful restraint. "Professor," he said respectfully, "may I speak with Charlotte?" The historian studied them both before nodding. Moments later, Charlotte found herself alone with the king. The silence felt strangely uncomfortable. Ethan looked toward the rain-covered windows. The council reviewed the evidence this morning. Charlotte lowered her gaze. And no one could disprove it. Her heart tightened. Hearing the words spoken aloud somehow made everything feel more real. Ethan remained quiet for several seconds. Finally, he said something she never expected. "I owe you an apology." Charlotte blinked. "For what?" Ethan met her eyes. "For allowing others to define your worth." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. "You barely knew me." A shadow crossed his expression. "That is exactly the problem." Charlotte looked away. Memories of the moon ceremony returned. Olivia's laughter. The crowd's whispers. The feeling of standing completely alone while everyone decided who mattered and who did not. Ethan followed her gaze toward the rain outside. "I should have paid more attention." Charlotte said nothing. Because part of her wanted to believe him. Another part remembered how easy it had been for everyone to overlook her before this discovery. As the afternoon passed, more confirmations arrived. Additional records uncovered by royal historians strengthened the claim further. By sunset, even the most skeptical advisors struggled to deny the truth. The final piece arrived in the form of an old royal seal preserved within a secured archive vault. The design matched Charlotte's pendant perfectly. Professor Whitmore examined both artifacts side by side before quietly removing his spectacles. His eyes glistened with emotion. "There can be no doubt anymore," he said. The room fell silent. Charlotte looked down at the silver pendant resting in her palm. The object she had carried since childhood no longer felt like a simple keepsake. It felt like a doorway opening into a forgotten past. Outside, palace bells began ringing across the capital as evening settled over Mooncrest. And for the first time in a generation, the kingdom stood on the edge of a truth powerful enough to change its future forever. By the next morning, the truth could no longer be contained within palace walls. News spread across Mooncrest City like wildfire carried by the wind. Merchants discussed it in crowded marketplaces. Scholars debated it inside universities. Noble families gathered behind closed doors, desperately trying to understand how an overlooked omega from the royal archives had become the center of the kingdom's attention. Charlotte felt the change everywhere she went. The same people who once passed her without a second glance now stopped to offer polite greetings. Servants who had barely acknowledged her presence suddenly bowed their heads. The attention felt strange, almost uncomfortable. Nothing about her had changed. She was still the same woman who organized records, repaired damaged books, and spent quiet evenings reading beside a small apartment window. Yet somehow the world had decided to see her differently. That realization troubled her more than she expected. Late that afternoon, Charlotte walked through the palace gardens hoping to escape the endless questions. Autumn leaves drifted across stone pathways, while fountains shimmered beneath the fading sunlight. For the first time in days, she found a moment of peace. Then she heard familiar voices ahead. Several young noblewomen stood near a marble gazebo. Among them was Olivia Sterling. Charlotte slowed her steps. Months ago, Olivia would have ignored her completely. Today was different. The moment Olivia noticed her, the conversation stopped. An uneasy silence followed. Charlotte could still remember the remarks made during the moon ceremony. The laughter, the humiliation, the certainty that she would never matter. Now those same faces looked uncertain, almost nervous. "Charlotte," Olivia said, forcing a smile. "I have been hoping to speak with you." Charlotte studied her quietly. "About what?" Olivia hesitated. "There have been misunderstandings." Charlotte almost laughed at the word. Misunderstandings. Such a gentle description for years of arrogance and dismissal. Yet she felt no desire to argue. No desire for revenge. Only exhaustion. "I think everyone understood perfectly," Charlotte replied calmly. Olivia's expression tightened. Before she could answer, another voice interrupted. "Miss Hayes." The women turned. Alpha King Ethan Blackwood approached along the garden path. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere. Olivia stepped aside. Charlotte noticed something unusual in Ethan's expression. Respect. Genuine respect. Not because of a title, not because of rumors, but because he had finally begun paying attention to the person standing before him. "The council has reached a decision," Ethan said softly. Charlotte's heart skipped. What kind of decision? Ethan looked toward the palace rising above the gardens. "Tomorrow morning, the kingdom will receive an official announcement." A nervous feeling settled inside her chest. And after that, Ethan met her eyes. After that, everyone will know the truth. Charlotte followed his gaze toward the distant palace towers glowing beneath the evening sky. For years, she had believed her future would be small and predictable. Now every path ahead seemed uncertain. Around them, the gardens remained peaceful. The fountains continued flowing. The leaves continued falling. Yet beneath that calm surface, Mooncrest stood on the edge of a moment that would be remembered for generations. And when the sun rose the next day, the woman once dismissed as insignificant would step into a destiny no one had imagined. The palace bells began ringing shortly after sunrise. Their deep echoes rolled across Mooncrest City, drawing people from every district toward the central square. Merchants left their shops. Scholars paused their work. Families gathered beneath banners hanging from stone buildings. Everyone knew an announcement was coming. Few understood how important it would be. Inside the palace, Charlotte stood alone near a tall mirror while attendants prepared the ceremonial hall. She wore a simple cream-colored dress chosen by Professor Whitmore himself. Nothing extravagant, nothing designed to impress. Charlotte preferred it that way. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the silver pendant resting against her chest. The same pendant that had traveled with her through every stage of her life. The same pendant everyone once ignored. A gentle knock sounded at the door. "Come in," she said. Ethan entered quietly. For a moment neither spoke. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating floating dust particles in the air. The room felt strangely peaceful despite the historic day unfolding beyond its walls. "The square is full," Ethan said softly. Charlotte managed a nervous smile. "That does not make me feel better." To her surprise, Ethan laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh in her presence. "Good," he replied. "Because I am nervous too." Charlotte looked at him. "You?" "The entire kingdom is about to learn it overlooked one of the most important people in its history." His expression grew serious. "That should make all of us nervous." Minutes later, the great ceremonial hall filled with nobles, advisors, historians, and community leaders. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Charlotte remained behind a side entrance while official proceedings began. Professor Whitmore stepped forward first. With remarkable clarity, he presented the evidence gathered over the previous weeks. Ancient records, family registries, sealed decrees, the royal crest. One piece after another formed an undeniable chain of truth. The audience listened in stunned silence. Some exchanged shocked glances. Others simply stared ahead, unable to process what they were hearing. Then came the moment everyone would remember. Ethan rose from his seat and addressed the hall. For many years, the final heir of House Valemont remained hidden from history. His voice carried across the chamber. Today that chapter ends. He extended a hand toward the entrance. Charlotte felt her heartbeat racing as she stepped forward. The room became completely silent. Hundreds of eyes turned toward her. Many belonged to people who once overlooked her. Others belonged to people who had judged her without knowing her story. Yet none of that mattered now. Charlotte walked steadily to the center of the hall. Professor Whitmore's eyes shone with pride. Ethan stood beside her. "Charlotte Hayes," he announced, "is recognized by this kingdom as the last living heir of House Valemont." A collective gasp swept through the audience. Some nobles lowered their heads immediately. Others looked overwhelmed by disbelief. Among them stood Olivia Sterling. Gone was the confidence she once carried. For the first time, she seemed to understand how wrong she had been. Charlotte looked across the crowd. She could have enjoyed the vindication. She could have reminded everyone how they treated her. Instead, she simply stood with quiet dignity. Because true worth had never come from titles. And as applause slowly filled the hall, Charlotte realized something extraordinary. The greatest victory was not proving everyone else wrong. It was finally understanding who she had always been. The days that followed changed Mooncrest in ways no one could have imagined. The official recognition of Charlotte Hayes as the last living heir of House Valemont became the most discussed event in the kingdom's modern history. Yet while nobles argued over lineage and advisors debated protocol, Charlotte focused on something much simpler. She returned to the royal archives. The same shelves remained. The same books waited to be restored. The same sunlight filtered through the tall windows each morning. For her, those familiar details were a reminder that identity was not built in a single day. 1 week after the announcement, a special gathering was held in the palace courtyard. Citizens traveled from across the kingdom to attend. Families filled the stone pathways. Merchants closed their shops early. Scholars, workers, and nobles stood side by side beneath banners bearing the ancient crest of House Valemont. Charlotte stepped onto the platform wearing an elegant but modest cream-colored gown. The silver pendant rested against her chest. As she looked across the crowd, she recognized many faces. Some had supported her. Others had ignored her. A few had openly judged her. Yet standing there now, she felt no anger. Only gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment. Professor Whitmore stood nearby, smiling proudly. Years of searching through forgotten history had finally restored a piece of truth to the kingdom. Ethan Blackwood addressed the crowd first. His voice carried clearly through the courtyard. "A kingdom is strongest when it values character above status," he said. "For too long, we failed to see the worth of someone who had been serving this community all along." The audience listened quietly. Ethan then turned toward Charlotte. There was no trace of the distance that once separated them. "The future of Mooncrest will be brighter because of the example she has set." Charlotte felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her chest. After the applause faded, she stepped forward. Hundreds of eyes watched her. Months earlier, that attention would have terrified her. Now she stood calmly beneath the afternoon sun. "I spent most of my life believing I was ordinary," she began. "And perhaps I still am." Soft laughter rippled through the crowd. "The truth about my family changes where I came from. It does not change who I choose to be." Silence followed as her words settled over the courtyard. Kindness matters. Integrity matters. The way we treat people matters. Because we never truly know someone's story. Many lowered their eyes. Others nodded thoughtfully. Even Olivia Sterling stood among the crowd, listening in silence. Charlotte did not speak of revenge. She did not remind anyone of old insults. Her dignity accomplished far more than anger ever could. As the gathering ended and golden sunlight bathed the palace in warmth, Ethan joined her beside the courtyard fountain. For a moment, they simply watched families laughing together. "You handled that better than any ruler I have ever known," Ethan said. Charlotte smiled. "Maybe that is because I spent most of my life learning what it feels like to be overlooked." Ethan returned the smile. Around them, Mooncrest felt different. Lighter. Wiser. And as the evening sky turned shades of gold and blue above the kingdom, Charlotte finally understood the lesson hidden within her journey. True nobility had never been about blood. It had always been about the choices a person made when no one was watching.